Wendy's asked that we take a short reading. It's going to be from Matthew 22, starting at verse 34, going to verse 40. I'm using a Gideon Bible. It's one I bought in a second-hand shop, not one that I brought down from the bedroom. So, in case you thought I was up to no good. So, Matthew 22, verse 34. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So I'm going to invite Wendy now to answer the question, pose the question. What should we make of the law of Moses? Wendy, I'll get out of the way now.
Thank you very much. So, nice to be here. I do teach law, but I don't teach any of this stuff. And academics tend to have very narrow fields. So what I'm really an expert in is comparative regulation of bailiffs. That's what I know about. So not legal history, not Mosaic law, and not constitutional law, which I'll talk about a little bit, but I do know a bit about law. So it's really difficult to know where to pitch from this subject, in the sense that many of you, I think, from here will have read around the origin of the Bible, the composition of the Bible, the time period over which it was composed, will have read different views about how the law fits into that. And depending on what you've read and where you've come from, you're likely to have quite varying views, I guess, about how the Bible has been shaped. And we might have a discussion about that afterwards, but I don't really want to get into that particular discussion at the moment. So while I think the Bible was written over a period of time, I think it was probably based on ancient, at least oral traditions, maybe some written traditions. I've read a lot of the I've read some of the material on the sources. As an academic, I'm kind of critical of other academics, and I think they make a lot of assumptions which you have to test. So it's really difficult to know how much you can trust what academics say. And I'm going to take as my starting point today that we can assume that the law of Moses was given at more or less the time that it was said, that the Bible says it was produced. But as I say, we can have discussions about that if you want to. In terms of the format of the Mosaic Law, one of the points that's often made is that it's very like Babylonian law, and that since people have discovered various sort of ancient Near Eastern laws and treaties, then parallels are drawn between what the Mosaic Law looks like and what other ancient laws look like, and I say particularly Babylonian law, particularly the Code of Hammurabi. And I also find that slightly odd as an idea. So there are certainly things about the way that the Law of Moses is written and the Law of Hammurabi is written that are similar in the form that they take, which has in some ways, some parts commands, like the sort of thou shalt and shalt not do things, but a lot of it is in what's described as a casuistic structure, a structure that says if this happens, then the result will be that. And there's an example of that I'll give on the next slide. So both of them have that kind of format, but actually the subject matters that they talk about are really very different, and I'll come back to that as well. So it seems to me that ancient laws, for whatever reason, developed in such a way that a casuistic structure was the normal way of producing and presenting laws. We can also see that in English legal tradition, that you go back 1,000 years and you've got a sort of limited number of cases which are briefly reported, and it will be a decision on a particular set of facts. So analogies are often drawn between, as I say, the Mosaic Law and Babylonian law. But the same sort of structure you can also find in ancient Roman law. I'll give you an example from the 12 tables in a moment, which are the beginnings of Roman law that are known about. And one of those has some quite significant parallels with the way that the Mosaic Law was structured. And this suggests to me that there is a commonality in the way that people thought about law, developed law in ancient times. And just briefly on this slide then, I've talked about, if you like, the development of laws. So for a long period of time we have a similar inscription approach. We find various inscriptions, tables, stelae that have got lists of laws on. As we move a bit nearer to modern times, if we move into the time of the Mishnah, so that's the oral law, the Jewish oral law, collected around about 200 CE. We've also got the Institutes of Gaius, which are Roman collections of cases, collections of cases and statements of what the law might be. And at round about that period of time, round about 100 to 200 CE, there seems to be a similar process going on in different legal systems of collecting the materials together that have been developed so far and saying we ought to commit these to writing, and we ought to try to structure them in some way. We ought to collect them under headings where they can be understood as being grouped together as laws that fit together. We ought to start to try to systematise the law more than has been done in the past. And then if we move on to about another sort of 300 or so years later, those collections of cases and ideas are still being used, but they're being added to and commentated on. And so it seems to me that there's some value in saying that a similar sort of development happened in Jewish law with the Talmud, of collecting the material together and having further commentaries, which were then collected and sort of fixed in time as a document around about 500 CE. And the same sort of thing was happening with Roman law, that at that time there was also material that had been the subject of further discussion that was fixed in time and collected as the Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian in the Byzantine Empire. And actually, for a period after that, those collections of law became, for the rabbis, for Jewish law, for really the whole of the Western world, as far as the Roman law was concerned, the basis on which legal developments took place, with a greater or lesser degree of systematisation. And you certainly, the law in England took a different turn with the development of case law in England, which I'll come back to also. But for most of Europe, the way that the law has developed can be traced back to Roman law and canon law. And so there are ways, it seems to me that you can say that in very general terms, there has been an approach to the development of the law over the centuries which is parallel in significant parts of the world. If we look at just one little bit of the Code of Hammurabi and Deuteronomy, you can see that the casuistic structure, that if-then structure, we've got a section here on slavery, so in the Code of Hammurabi, if anyone finds a runaway male or female slave in the open country and bring them to their masters, the master of the slave shall pay him 2 shekels of silver. So if this happens, then that's the consequence. The form's the same, but the content is completely different. You know, the Code of Hammurabi, if you find a runaway slave, you're supposed to hand it back to the master, and if somebody holds slaves and keeps them away from their master, then that person can be put to death. Whereas Deuteronomy has completely the opposite approach and says if a slave has taken refuge with you, don't hand them over to their master. So the form's the same, but the content is completely and utterly different. If we look at Roman law, so roughly 500 or 450 BC, sorry, the type's a bit small here, but I've put in some examples of Roman tort law where there are harms that have compensation for harm. And we can see that there's similar thinking in that period of time to what you find in the Mosaic Law. If we look at number 2, if anyone's broken another's limb, there shall be retaliation in kind unless he compounds for compensation with him. So that's the same as a sort of eye for an eye and tooth for tooth that you would find in Exodus. There should be retaliation in kind. There's also the possibility of compensation in the next, in the paragraph 3, which we also find in Exodus. Damage caused by animals is also discussed in Exodus. The goring ox seems to play a huge role in discussions of Jewish law. And we have a similar sort of thing. It doesn't mention goring oxes, but Roman law also talks about quadrupeds that have caused damage, and that they should be either surrendering that which did damage or assessing the damage. Very similar sort of principles to those that you find in Exodus, and so on. So I haven't actually seen anything that particularly discusses, whether Roman law might have drawn on Babylonian law, but the kind of structure is the same, and it represents, I think, the way that people thought about law at that time. I've included these 2 slides because I just think they're really interesting, but I'll move on fairly quickly because I know time, when you're speaking, time vanishes, doesn't it? But in thinking about the development of Jewish law and modern European law based on Roman law, again, a kind of mindset, a kind of way of thinking about how things develop can be shown in the way that they printed the documents that they were working with. So here we have an example of the Talmud. The pink bit in the middle is the Mishnah, the oral law. The yellow bit is then the discussions that surrounded the oral law, which were then contained in the Talmud. And the surrounding kind of circle of discussions is the commentary on that, which was then led to the later developments of the law. As the years went by, more and more kind of commentary is added, and then it's systematized to some extent, but the commentary gradually builds. And you can see kind of the same thing with Roman law, that we have medieval manuscripts which have the laws of Justinian in the middle, and then the people who are developing the law kind of providing their commentaries around the edges. That was the way that people thought at that particular point in time about how to develop law. So if we think, and I'll build on a bit more in some later slides, but if we think about Mosaic law compared to other ancient laws, as I've said, there's a similar format and style. There's a similar presentation in terms of kind of inscriptions. There are definitely some analogous rules, things like the law of retaliation, the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth approach, which you find across different legal systems. But what's more interesting to me is the fact that the content of the rules is really very different, because we're talking about different societies with different priorities. So the law of Hammurabi is very much a sort of urban, hierarchical society. It has lots of rules about merchants and innkeepers. It talks about irrigation systems. Like Jewish law, it talks about marriage and dowry and inheritance, but it does so in different ways with different priorities. It has a lot more to say about inheritance than the Mosaic law does. It talks quite a lot about adoption, because it was important, I think, for in ancient societies. Sometimes people would adopt someone who could look after them in their old age. Class distinctions feature a lot in the Code of Hammurabi. The sort of penalties that somebody might have to pay if they caused harm would depend on who you were causing harm to, whether it was somebody who's at the top of society or lowest in society or a slave. So much these class distinctions play an important role across a lot of the laws. There's a lot about charging hire for use of goods, for rental of land, and the whole final section of the Code of Hammurabi is all about payment for services and how much you pay if the service goes right and how much you pay if it goes wrong, or how liable you are if you're providing a service as a doctor or a dentist or something else and you manage to harm somebody in the course of your work. Whereas The Mosaic Law has very little to say about many of these things. Doesn't have an urban orientation. It's not particularly interested in property laws, but it has a lot to say about sacrifice, which you don't find regulated in other ancient legal systems. You'll find records of people making sacrifices. You'll find records of the sort of study of entrails and the festivals that took place, but you don't find laws that regulate how that should happen. You don't find public health laws in the same way, and purity rules. You don't find dietary rules. You don't find much about welfare, which plays an enormous role in the Mosaic Law. You don't find laws about periods of rest and festivals in the same way. So again, there are certainly records, say in Babylonian era, of festivals taking place, but not laws that regulate how those festivals should take place. And the other thing that's particularly distinctive and important, I think, about the Mosaic Law is the way that it is embedded in narrative. You can see how the laws fit into a particular storyline in a way that you don't see, again, for something like the Code of Hammurabi or the Roman 12 Tables. You know why the law is being given and what its purpose is. And the purpose is really important. So we have things like, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and therefore you should care about people, you should care about slaves, you should care about people's freedom. You are people holy to the Lord, and that affects the way that you should behave. So the rationale for the laws is made much more explicit in the Mosaic Law. And actually, in terms of the development of Jewish law up to today, it's one of the reasons why it's been very difficult to systematise Jewish law, because the idea that there's a story behind it and that there are principles from those stories that you should keep drawing on, not forget, by turning something into a system of rules, is something which plays very largely in the minds of Jewish thinkers. So I just wanted to include this quickly. Again, people who do try to systematise Jewish law to a greater extent will talk about the 213 mitzvot that you can find in the Mosaic Law. And the ones that are in bold are ones where that kind of category of ideas you could find in the Law of Hammurabi. Having said that, as I say, the content of the rules can be completely different as between Mosaic Law and the Law of Hammurabi, but the categories that are in bold are the ones that I would say were there's a particular overlap with Mosaic Law. Whereas the ones that are not in bold, and particularly the ones in red, are the ones that are sort of particularly, I would say, distinctive of the Mosaic Law, which you don't find elsewhere, around diet, purity, rest, sacrifice, tithes and taxes, and caring for one another. So, in terms of lessons for us, I would say one of the important things about Mosaic Law would be that God meets us where we are. That when the children of Israel started as a nation, they needed to have laws. Can't have a nation without having some kind of principles of laws. But if you dropped a perfect law down into a nation, they really wouldn't know what to do with it. And that was, so from my comparative law background, one of the things I found striking looking at my bailiffs is that there are basically three completely different systems of bailiff regulation in Europe, and you can trace the roots of each of those back at least 1,000 years. One of them you can trace back to Roman law, and the institutions that exist now still bear those sort of traces of their origins. Legal culture changes really slowly. You couldn't just drop, as I say, a perfect law down on a group of people 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. They wouldn't know what to do with it. So you have to give people laws that they can work with. So God meets us, God met the Israelites where they were, and God meets us where we are. And that's comforting to know that God is happy to work with us, whatever our position is. What I think might be a bit more interesting is the question of how far then, if you start off with a law that met the Israelites where they were, what do you do with that? How do you get from that to something more perfect? And And I think the objective was to get to something more perfect. I think this is something that people wrestle with, kind of, the law of Moses seems so kind of strange and uncivilized in some respects. Should we regard it as the law that's given by God for a particular reason as being, why would a perfect God make such an imperfect law? So, as I say, my starting point is that it's a law that the people could understand and work with, that it was something that had things in it that were familiar to them, and that we have to accept. For example, if they didn't have a state with civil servants and, say, prison officers, if you don't have prisons, then that sort of limits the way that you treat people who have done something wrong. You've got to think of ways of working with people's imperfections that are going to be manageable in the society they're in. But how do you get from that to something that's more perfect? And clearly the Israelites wouldn't have taught in terms of their constitution, but if we think about what constitutions do, constitutions, first of all, establish the authority that different power centres within a state have. What's the relationship between different power centres and what can they do? They define the powers and rights of citizens, and also importantly, they express the aspirations of society. So I've got my little bit from the American Constitution. There are rights expressed in many modern constitutions, recognition of human rights, that laws are interpreted in such a way as to try to comply with human rights obligations. There is a purpose in the way that the laws are interpreted, and that helps to define how the law develops. And I think we can see the same sort of thing. We can see things embedded within the Mosaic Law that would enable improvements to take place. So if we think about the aspirations of the society, the underpinning principles that would guide interpretation, we can start off with the two main commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might, and love your neighbour as yourself. So those are objectives that we can, or aim for, that people could aim for in interpreting the law. You've also got the statement in Genesis that man is made in the image of God. So if an aspiration would be to be more like God. And in Exodus 34, we have a statement of what God is like: merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, and so on. So there are plenty of principles and aspirations that can guide interpretation for those who are prepared to look for them. There's also institutions that can help to develop the law. So Deuteronomy talks about judges, Levites, chiefs and officers as the people who interpret the law. You should look for able men from all the people, men who fear God and are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people. So we've got a range of different people with different skills, but who are God-fearing, who can help to develop the law. They are deciding cases. They are developing the law as it goes along. There's also the potential for reference to Urim and Thummim. So in the case of difficult decisions, you can ask directly for guidance from God as to how to develop the law. In Numbers, Moses is told to collect up 70 men of the elders and bring them, and they will bear some of the burden of the people and will help Moses to make decisions. Again, people were coming to him all the time for him to decide their cases. This would be developing the law. And they were inspired interpreters. The 70 men of the elders had some of the Spirit of God to help them. So there was something to help to move the law along there.
So we can see that the Mosaic Law has the people in place.
I've got something where I've been recorded. Bear in mind. Let me turn that down. There are opportunities to discuss local decisions. Now, interestingly, when people, interesting to me, I can see eyes closing around the room from time to time, so perhaps not quite so interestingly to you, but one of the ways in which English law developed was through having the main courts in London, and judges would go out on circuit and they would meet problems from all around the country, and then they would come back to London, and so you've got a place where they could discuss the law. in one place, and then they would go out on circuit again, and so you'd be able to collect together. Why we have something called the common law in England is because it was common because everybody was returning to London to discuss common problems. And I think you could see the scope for that, something like that in Israel, because they had to go up to Jerusalem 3 times in the year. So you'd have the elders in their cities and villages making decisions, and they'd come across hard cases, and they could meet together and have a discussion about how those cases should be resolved, so that you could have some kind of commonality and some major discussion about how difficult situations should be resolved. And then finally, the law was supposed to be read to everybody, and it was supposed to be inscribed on on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, that there would be a knowledge of the law that everybody should have. So people could be held to account for not complying with the law, and there would be more scope for discussion of the law amongst ordinary people. So there are some constitutional principles there that would enable the law of Moses to develop, not to be fixed in time, but to develop as society developed. And I think we can also see lessons for us there. And then there are questions here in terms of the church, Christadelphians. How far could we say that we've taken these principles into account or not? And that might depend on your particular ecclesia or your particular experience. Clearly, one feature would be the underpinning principles, that we are made in the image of God, that we've got Christ as an example of the image of God, and looking to Christ and looking to loving God and loving our neighbour should guide our interpretation of the rest of scriptures or the rest of the laws, the rules that we try to implement. Do we involve able people who fear God enough in our decision-making processes? Again, this will depend probably very much on your local situation. I would say my experience has tended to be people very often get picked because they've been doing something for many years, or because they were the only person who was sort of willing to do it. The idea that people are being selected out because they're particularly able and God-fearing might not always work in practice. We should, of course, seek guidance from God. There were the sort of people talked a bit about whether the Holy Spirit dwelling in us. To what extent do we try to seek the guidance of God in what we're doing? Again, this comes back to discussions we had about free will and our own choice. There's lots of unknowns there, but we should at least be seeking guidance from God to help us to make good decisions. Then there's, like the meetings in Jerusalem, to what extent is there scope for opportunities to meet and broaden discussion in a large forum where we can draw on lots of different strands of thought to reach good decisions? Again, your experiences may vary as to how far that happens. And again, and this may reflect my own particular experience, to what extent do we actually think about the details of how things should be done? So the law got into detail, how things ought to be done more precisely. I've heard lots of exhortations which talk sort of generally about being a nice person, but maybe don't discuss enough what that means in practice, and maybe there aren't enough discussions about really how we put into practice our faith. Or maybe you're in a ecclesia where that happens a lot and you don't have a problem with that. But there are just some lessons there that we could draw on as to what extent the constitutional structure in the Mosaic Law might be useful to us today. I found really quite useful this book by Joshua Berman. So Joshua Berman is an Orthodox Jew who I suppose decided to take the kind of source critics and others on their own ground, and his expertise is in looking at ancient laws, ancient inscriptions, and seeing how far what's in the Mosaic Law matches up with the world as it was presented by rulers in round about 1300 BC. So he looks at, among other things, he's written a number of books that look at different aspects of this, but Created Equal is about the way in which the Mosaic Law differs from other laws in the ancient Near East at around about that time by treating citizens as equals. And he compares the situation of the Israelites with all the surrounding nations, where you'd got the king as the apex, the king as the absolute ruler, with a very small elite around them, and then the majority of people being very much lower in society. So he thinks that the Mosaic Law is very distinctive in treating all people as equals. I'm going to jump over that. So I move on to some of the kind of how this plays out in the rules themselves. But in terms of timing, he suggests that there's parallels between Deuteronomy and the Hittite treaties from around about the 1300. But two things I wanted to highlight. One is the existence of a separation of powers in Israel. So there wasn't, the way that the laws were designed was intended to prevent a concentration of power. So a king is mentioned, a king is sort of not particularly desirable. Kings were supposed to write out the law. The kings aren't given any job to do apart from writing out the law, in fact. They should just write out the law and then sit on the throne. And most of the work would be done by priests, Levites, judges, prophets and elders. So you have different power centres and therefore they could balance one another out. You weren't getting a concentration of power in one place. It's argued that the American system, a lot of the people involved in creating the American system sort of drew on Deuteronomic thinking in terms of designing the balance of powers. I've heard counter-arguments as well, but that's certainly one strand of thinking about the development of the American Constitution. So a balancing out between different segments of society with different opportunities to exercise a voice and different power structures meant that you didn't have the accumulation of power that could lead to abuse. You could get different perspectives being raised. Also, again, this depends on how much you're interested in these sorts of issues, because since I do regulation of bailiffs, debt recovery is kind of my my interest. But it's really interesting the way that the Mosaic Law tries to maintain equality, again by preventing economic concentration of power. So you've got this dispersion amongst different groups in society of prophets and elders and priests and so on, which prevents the political accumulation of power. But you've also got structures that prevent the economic concentration of power because the poor are being looked after. So land tenure is by families in small communities who could be expected to assist one another. And you couldn't sell land in perpetuity. So you couldn't have a family buying up all the local land and becoming major landowners, because at the end of the 50 years, the land should go back to its original owners in the year of Jubilee. People would sell themselves into slavery. One of the issues that's debated is, why would the law of Moses allow slavery? Isn't that really uncivilized? But it was the perfectly normal way in ancient societies of dealing with debt. You have a bad harvest, you've got no money, you start to sell things. When you've run out of other things to sell, you sell your family, eventually you sell yourself. Because it's the only way to survive. And so, again, the law of Moses provides for a 7-year release. It provides for the person who has bought you to send you out with crops to replant and start again, with animals to go to start your herd again. So that there is a potential for people who have reached complete kind of insolvency and poverty to start again, to get a new opportunity. And so the rules basically on land tenure and slavery prevent this economic accumulation of power within society. Tithing also exists again. Every third year there would be tithes for the poor and for the Levites. So again, you've got protection, you've also got gleaning in the fields, as in Ruth. So lots of measures to try to protect people. So again, thinking about lessons for us, the emphasis of the law is on love and respect for God and for neighbours. That was partly, if I just move back to doesn't want to go backwards now. Okay. If I go back to these, far too much stuff. These laws, you can see it starts off with respect for God. The first red line, love and brotherhood, welfare, treatment of Gentiles. So respect for God, love and brotherhood, and all these sorts of things are baked into the way that the law operates. There's very little on commerce and property ownership. So whereas that featured more in the law of Hammurabi, and certainly in Roman law, there's lots of rules on property ownership and rental and so on. But Mosaic law has very little to say about property ownership. It's not really very interested in it. Lessons for us about different sources of authority, having different voices, listening out for wise voices from different sources. Changing circumstances brought change in the law. Actually, I didn't bring that in what I've said, and but you can see, and I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but through the Bible, new laws being introduced. There were changes to reflect changes in society, and that's something that we should bear in mind, that change in society leads to change in the law. And although some laws can be followed by individuals, and we all try to do our best, some need the work of a community. So the tithing system needed to have a structure to put it into place. And one of the great emphases of the law is on care for the poor. Do we have structures in place for that? Do we rely on individuals? I know there are some structures. Do we have enough structures? Is that a big enough emphasis of what we do as a community? We're a shrinking community. There's a limited amount we could do. Should we be more involved in structures in society that help to care for the poor? Just some thoughts to bring out there. I'm just going to jump over all that lot because I knew I wouldn't have time for it. So just a couple of things to think about then to finish off with. Two issues really to think in the New Testament: Christ and the law, and what's the attitude of Paul to the law. We've already talked about the fact that I think the Mosaic law was designed in such a way that the intention was to work towards a more perfect law, and of course that's what we see in Christ. And when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's what Christ is talking about, a law which comes from the heart and not the head. We go from you shouldn't murder to you shouldn't be angry. That we're no longer thinking in terms of stopping people's actions, but cultivating a whole new heart. And that was what the perfected law would look like. So Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount talks about the way that the law is perfected in relation to murder and divorce. So you shouldn't divorce, that was from the hardness of hearts. The law talks about adultery, but you shouldn't even lust after somebody. The law talks about oaths, but you should just promise and not swear oaths. It's a law of the heart, not the head. And we're told in Romans 10 that Christ is the end of the law. And I think, again, as a lawyer, this is quite interesting, that Christ is the telos of the law. And the telos is the purpose, it's the end result. And we talk about a teleological interpretation of the law, an interpretation of the law that is designed to satisfy a particular purpose. One of the things I teach is European law, and the European treaties set out what the purpose of European law is. It's to create an ever greater union. And so the European Court of Justice adopts what we call a teleological interpretation of the law to try to reach the objective of the EU treaties. You have the same kind of thing here, that Christ is the telos of the law. You have a teleological interpretation of the Mosaic law, if you like, or of any law, to reach to Christ as the image of God and as the direction in which we should be going. What about Paul then? Paul's relationship with the law is something which is much debated. Academic writers will say it's a very complex subject. There's lots of people who've got very fixed ideas about Paul and the law from different perspectives and don't want to move. But I think there's a book called, I think it's called Paul and the Law by Brian Rosner, and I think it really draws some interesting distinctions. First of all, we're not under the Torah, and I'll talk about Torah rather than the Mosaic law as such, because when we think about the Mosaic law, we think about systems of rules. But when Paul talks about the law, he's thinking about the Torah as a whole, the narrative and the law. It's the whole picture that he wants to draw on. So we're under the law of Christ. The new covenant, we've spoken about the new commandment, that we should love one another. But Paul still sometimes talks about the law as having continued usefulness. Sometimes he talks about the law in positive terms as well as negative terms. The bit that he criticises is the barriers that Judaism creates between Jews and Gentiles, things like circumcision and particular dietary laws. But he will talk about the law being good as well. And Brian Rosner says that he thinks that Paul is using the law in basically 3 different ways, and we have to, as we're reading the New Testament, as we're reading Paul's letters, we need to think about which of those senses is meant at the time. So it can mean law as in a set of rules, but it can also talk about the law in terms of prophecy, as prophecy is fulfilled in Christ. And that's something Christadelphians do pretty well, isn't it? You know, looking at types, looking at fulfilment of the law in Christ, talking about Jesus on the road to Emmaus, explaining from the law and the prophets that the Bible talks about him. So that bit we're kind of quite familiar with. But Paul talks about the Torah as wisdom literature, that something as a well that we can draw on of wisdom about God. It explains God's role in creation, his plans. We've really got the whole of the gospel, haven't we, in the early part of the Bible, with creation, slavery, and freedom from slavery. It's a picture that's repeated and repeated. And God's purpose for humanity is explained there. It gives us lots of examples of people's lives and of right and wrong behaviour. So the suggestion is, final slide, I promise you, Christ is the telos of the law. Christ is the aim for which we interpret any set of rules now. And while the Torah can be a source of prophecies and types about Christ, it can also be a source of wisdom on which to draw, a well from which we can draw, which perhaps we don't make enough use of. And again, it depends on your own particular ecclesial experience. But some of the material I've read more recently has been Jewish discussions of the law. I've read lots of things by Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi in the UK, who unfortunately died during COVID. But his ability to take passages from the Torah and draw lessons from them is one that I find fascinating, and a real source of sort of encouragement about how we can use these passages as a source of wisdom. Perhaps, again, as I say, it depends on your own particular ecclesial experience, but perhaps more than we do at the moment, and that if we see the Torah in that light, that could be quite inspiring rather than a set of dry rules. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.